Hello, my name is Grant Van Vranken. Today I'm going to introduce you to my 7 times great-grandfather, a man named Casper Taub. You may be asking, why should he be remembered? Well, he was a founding father of Pittsburgh, and if you've ever heard the name Negley, Winebiddle, or Mellon, you've heard of his descendants, and you can see he's got this big parcel of land here. It's 562 acres in what would become Pittsburgh. Here we have a broader view showing Casper's land. And here's the Allegheny River, the Monongahela River, and over here's the Ohio. So his land is only from here to here is about 4 miles, according to the grant, because Fort Duquesne was right there at the tip, and then Fort Pitt's going to end up being a little bit further back, but still right here in that triangle. The Daub family originates from Minfeld, which is a little town in between Germany and France. Johann Casper Daub was baptized October 1706, and he married Maria Weber on October 19, 1728. They would go on to have 11 children between 1729 and 1748. Shortly after the birth of their last child, they would go on to immigrate to the New World and never look back. But their ancestors had lived in Minfeld since the 1500s, when a Bernhard Fosselman and his wife were having children starting in the 1570s. He would die in the early 1620s, found hanged in his tree in his garden by his son-in-law, Andre Daub, the direct ancestor of Casper. Jacob, my 6 times great-grandfather, who usually went by Daub or Dupe, was first identified because of a lawsuit that states that he had 3.5 years left on his indenture dating from the 25th of December 1753. Stated he was 18 years old. He was working for Henry Cameron, a blacksmith, and the remainder of his indenture was valued at £8, 1 shilling, which was quite a lot of money back then. And chances are his dad was already here by then. For sure, his uncle Nicholas was here. He got here in 1752. And Nicholas would factor into my Jacob's line, because when my Jacob died in early 1771 at Carrollton Manor on the 100 acres he rented, Nicholas and his son Jacob signed the inventory of the estate, which was common practice to have family members sign. And that's why we assume most of the family probably arrived in the 1750s, because we know for sure Jacob was here. Nicholas came in 1752, but unfortunately there are no records of when the rest of them actually arrived. Henry Bouquet was born in 1719 in Switzerland as Henri Louis Bouquet, and he was a typical Swiss mercenary, worked for the Dutch a couple times, worked for the Kingdom of Sardinia, and then he got a great job for any mercenary. He was appointed the lieutenant colonel of the 60th Regiment of Foot, the Royal American Regiment, where he learned up close and personal that typical European style warfare will not work in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, areas like that. And specifically, he learns from the disaster in 1755 when General Braddock traipsed through the frontier and decided that he was going to attack Fort Duquesne with his 1,300 strong army. And at the Battle of Monongahela on the 9th of July, 1755, his hubris got the best of him. And he didn't die that day, but he died on the 13th. Took him a few days to die. And out of his 1,300 men, 457 would be killed, over 450 wounded, and they were up against less than 900 French and Indian forces, and of that, I think 110 were French. And they suffered 39 killed and 57 wounded. Terrible defeat. And Henry Bouquet learned from that. He studied it, and he was determined not to end up the same way. Which is why when he was part of General John Forbes' expedition in 1758, he had very clear instructions to his outriders or scouts that if they were to happen upon the enemy, they were to come back immediately and notify the rest of the force, and that they would all gather up. They'd put all the supplies in the middle, and he's famous for he built a temporary fort out of flour bags. Because he was trying to get to Fort Duquesne fast. He did not take wagons. He took horses and mules and sacks of flour, which he then used to build a little fortification. And it worked. But he also understood that he was basically alone in the wilderness, and he had to be smart or he would end up dead. So in 1753, as I said, George Washington had visited the forks of the Ohio, and he went back in 1754, which is when he built Fort Necessity. So in 1755, when he went with General Braddock, he knew a little bit of the ground where he was going, and I would have hoped that a general would listen to him, but yeah, Braddock didn't. So I think Washington and everybody was telling him, we need to go fast, we need to go quiet, but mainly we need to go fast. We need to get there as quickly as possible. And Braddock is like, nope, I want to take a bunch of people, I want to take a bunch of supplies, I want to take cannons, and I want to do it all in wagons. Now, mind you, these are woods that they have to transport all of this through thick woods, meaning they have to cut down trees to get the wagons through. And General Braddock is riding in his coach. Like, I don't think this guy quite understood just where in the BFE he was. Like, you're in the frontier, dude. You shouldn't be riding in a carriage. Get out and help. Something. But anyway, the French and their Indian allies monitor his progress or lack thereof. 4 to 5 miles a day is just grueling, excruciating. The Indians and the French literally can pick wherever the hell they want to attack him, and they do attack him on the 9th of July, and it's terrible. And Braddock will end up being buried nearby where Washington had built Fort Necessity the year previous. But the good news is, after this horrible defeat that is just stinging and really just kills morale on the frontier, um, 3 years later, 1758, General John Forbes decides he too is going to go to Fort Duquesne through the woods. He does not listen to George Washington and does not use the same route as Braddock. He cuts a new one, a new road, which is actually going to be very, very important. It's actually going to open up the route for people to start settling the Ohio Valley. Uh, and it's very important to our story because Casper Taub ends up getting a 300-acre plantation on the Forbes Road 4 miles from Fort Pitt at what's called 4 Mile Spring. And it says it's on the Forbes Road to Fort Ligonier, which is on the map there, which was built on this expedition. And all of these forts are important later on as well, other than necessity, because it was literally only used that one time. But like Fort Duquesne, once it's burned to the ground as the French retreat, the British build a new fort, not right on top of it, but like, you could spit and hit the new fort. Um, and they name it after the Secretary of State at the time, who will later become Prime Minister, William Pitt the Elder, hence Pittsburgh. And General Forbes is actually a fascinating guy to research. He was severely ill this entire expedition. He couldn't walk. He was basically in a hammock between two horses, taking him from place to place as they were headed towards Fort Duquesne. And he would actually end up going back to Philadelphia, and he died in early 1759. Probably, I think it was probably stomach cancer. They described it as a wasting disease of some kind. But anyway, he had a very able deputy in Colonel Bouquet, who he relied on heavily, and Colonel Bouquet and Forbes and all that with Washington would make it to Fort Duquesne, but it would be burned to the ground, and they would build a new one. Here's a map showing the triangle there at the forks, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, turning into the Ohio. And you can see Fort Duquesne was literally right on the tip of the peninsula there, and Fort Pitt was a little bit further back. And then on the left is an image of the fort around 1763, and you can see people had started building little cabins there. Settlers were moving in. And then the bottom image is 1765, and you can see just how much has been built around the fort by this point. This is, you can see there's a little round, well, octagonal building here on the exterior of the fort. This is the blockhouse of Fort Pitt that's still there. It was built in 1764, but there were five of them, I believe, at one time. This one's called Bouquet's Redoubt, and it actually has a plaque above the door that says Colonel H. Bouquet, 1764. Um, and it's the only one that survives of the original five, I believe, that were built. And the reason why it survives is because it was used as multi-family housing for a lot of its history. And then it was somehow ended up in the hands of the Daughters of the American Revolution, who still own it to this day. And they have done a wonderful job keeping it standing. And I believe there's exhibits in, I don't know, I want to go there myself because I've found a few mentions that say that Casper Taub and his family were the caretakers of Fort Pitt. I don't know how true that is. It was newspaper articles about Richard Mellon saying that his ancestor was the caretaker of Fort Pitt. So I would say hopefully they would know that better than I would. The year 1762 was a major change for Casper Taub and his family. I believe he must have performed some service in the 60th Royal American Regiment as one of the provincial militia or guides that Henry Bouquet had picked up along the way, because he did grant him a plantation just 4 miles from the fort, on decent land, which was fed by the 4 Mile Spring, um, called that because it was 4 miles from the fort, I guess. Um, and in exchange, Casper would give the commander of Fort Pitt a third of everything he grew on the land, except horses and cattle. But unfortunately, Casper would later tell us in a letter he wrote to, or a complaint he wrote to the governor of Pennsylvania, that he wasn't actually able to do that because of severe flooding and the Pontiac's War Rebellion is what it used to be called, but honestly, Pontiac's Uprising, Pontiac's War is definitely more appropriate because rebellion would indicate that he was a subject and he wasn't. Um, which is why he did what he did. They were proving they were not subject and they were trying to drive the settlers off their land, which would directly lead to the proclamation line of 1763 in October, but that came a little too late. So, November 1762, Casper gets this land, and from all accounts, he immediately builds a house there, moves his family, starts, trying to hack a living out of the wilderness with his family. So, this is a copy of the grant that Casper included with his complaint to the governor of Pennsylvania. And it says, "This is to certify that I have permitted Casper Tub or Tubbs to clear a plantation at the 4 Mile Spring on the old road going to Ligonier in order to raise provision for the use of this garrison and corn for the king's horses, and the conditions of the said grant are that the said Casper Tub shall pay every year to the commanding officer of this post, for the king's use, 1/3 of all produce of the said plantation, horses and cattle excepted, under penalty of forfeiting his improvement to the crown. Given under my hand as above, H. Bouquet, Colonel. Pretty clear. It just doesn't say how big the plantation is, so I'm not sure how they quite figured out, the boundaries of it, but it would later end up being 303 acres with, I think it said like 6% allowance for roads and right of way like that. 1763 is the year it all went wrong. Poor Casper. Here he is, just got his 300 acres, built his house, moved his whole family out there, and then everything that could go wrong went wrong. Like, everything goes wrong. The Indians are completely fed up with settlers encroaching on not just where they used to live that they've been driven out of, but what they consider their hunting grounds. And unlike the European settlers and even, multi-generation Americans at this point, the Indians still rely heavily on hunting for protein. The Europeans don't. So they see all this land just sitting there with no Indians on it, and they're like, hey, perfect grazing ground for all my cattle, my pigs. What they don't understand is, yes, the Indians don't live on it, but they definitely hunt on it. And they don't appreciate all these people clearing their hunting ground and putting their livestock on it. Now, don't get me wrong, some Native Americans do have livestock of their own, but not to the extent of the Europeans, and they move theirs around a lot more. So Pontiac was a very persuasive leader in his time, and he got together with a bunch of the different tribes in the area and said, hey, do you see what they're doing? They're literally killing us slowly. If it's not their diseases, it's them taking our land, our ability to feed ourselves, or outright war. So he gets together this impressive confederacy for its era. And he understands that this is like the last chance they have of showing the Europeans that they are not going to give up without a fight. And the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, is over by this point, and they are frustrated by what looks like unlimited expansion, because it is, into their sovereign ground. They wouldn't call it that, but into their tribal land. So they arrange to attack a bunch of forts up and down the frontier, starting with Fort Sandusky in May, all the way through. They attack Fort St. Joseph, Miami, Venango, LaBeouf, Presque Isle. They even lay siege to Fort Pitt and Fort Detroit, but they don't fall. And it's the just overwhelming planning that went into this that surprised the hell out of everyone. And it was an overwhelming success on the Indians' part. They destroyed, I think it was 8 forts. Um, and I think most of the people guarding those forts were killed, um, sometimes rather horrifically, like burning, torture, things like that. Um, and so the English are going through, especially at Fort Pitt, they're suffering a smallpox outbreak. And this is one of those moments of history where you wish you could go back and ask these people, what the hell are you thinking? So, in some letters between Colonel Bouquet and I know it says Forbes here, but I want to say it might have been Amherst, but whichever commander it was at the time, maybe it was Forbes. Anyway, they discussed the possibility of giving Indians smallpox infected blankets. And this has seriously hurt Henry Bouquet's reputation ever since. Um, Biological warfare, that kind of stuff. But he isn't actually the one who did it. He may have written about it, but he didn't actually do it. That honor goes to another Swiss mercenary who was actually the commander of the fort at the time because he was the highest ranking guy named Captain Simeon Ecuyer. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, but he decided to give some Indian traders that had come to the fort, um, that he was not exactly trustful of or happy with, as gifts. They gave them articles from people that had been infested with or infected with smallpox. But from everything we understand, all the people that they gave these to were still alive and kicking a month or two later, so it obviously didn't work. And everything scientific research shows spreading smallpox this way not actually all that viable. I actually don't know. I, I think you would almost have to have somebody like cough on the blanket or how, with smallpox, or rub their sores on it or something, have it still be wet and still have all the, particulates on it, and then give it to somebody and then basically like rub it all over their face and go to make it actually transfer. And even then, I'm not sure if it would. All I know is they've got horrible reputations for this, and it is abominable that they even thought of doing this. But I mean, if you look back through history, biological warfare has been around as long as people knew how to use it, launching bodies and dumping bloated corpses into wells. I mean, you know, we we know how to hurt each other. That's for sure. So it got so bad that May 31st, 1763, this letter was written from Fort Pitt, and published in the newspaper later on. It says, "We have most melancholy accounts here. The Indians have broke out in several places and murdered Colonel Clapham and his family. Also, two of our soldiers at the sawmill near the fort, and 2 scalps are taken from each man. An Indian has brought a war belt to Tuscarora and says Detroit is invested, and that Sandusky is cut off, and Ensign Pauley made prisoner. Levy's goods are stopped at Tuscarora by the Indians. Last night, 11 men were attacked at Beaver Creek, 8 or 9 of whom, it said, were killed." So, anyway, and they took horses and skins, and anyway, everybody's mad. Oh my gosh, it's a it's a huge uprising, and it took everybody by surprise, although it shouldn't have. These are illustrations of Colonel Bouquet dealing with the Indians. The one on the left is a conference where he was meeting with them to discuss what they wanted, what he could do for them. Uh, he did have a. I don't want to say he viewed them as equals because I don't think that's true. But I think that he had enough respect for their ability to wage war that he did not ever want to underestimate them. He was fully aware that one of the big things they liked to do was to capture prisoners because it gave them leverage. And the image on the right is him getting back children that had been captured in 1764. This is the proclamation line of 1763 that the king drew to hopefully manage some sort of peace between his subjects and the Indians, because he did not want to keep going to war with them. He couldn't afford it, and England was in financial distress at this point, because of the massive amounts of debt they incurred during the 7 Years' War. So, not only did the king say, you can't move past this line because I said so, I'm in a lot of debt and you're going to help pay it off because I said so. And oh, yeah, to help ensure you don't move past said line, I'm going to build a bunch of forts and I'm going to plant a bunch of soldiers there that you're going to have to help pay for because I'm broke, remember? Hence the Townshend Acts and the Boston Tea Party and the Revolutionary War. It's funny how it's all intertwined with the 7 Years' War proclamation line. You can just draw the lines and see how the Revolutionary War happened. It didn't just happen in Boston like everybody thought. It started all along the frontier by people questioning the authority of the king to just say, you can't move past this line because I said so. And he's, how many thousand miles away? And I mean, is he really going to know if I move? Does he really care? The answer is yes, he does really care. Is he going to know? Well, his troops are probably going to find out, and they're not going to be very nice about it. I'm pretty sure if they catch you living out past the line, I think they take everything you own and basically burn your house down. So do it at your own risk. And if they don't do it, I'm pretty sure the Indians are going to probably kill you and burn your house. So as I stated, Casper had applied to change his military land grant into a new purchase application, and that was April, I want to say it was April 1769. Then in July of 1769, he writes this letter to His Excellency the Governor Penn, on, it says June 28th, 1769, and then the land office enters a caveat on a survey for George Croghan because of land that he already had granted to him since 1762. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. It's kind of hard to read, and I'm not sure who actually wrote it, but it is signed Casper Tubbs, and it says, "Right Honorable Sir, this, I'm guessing, is, but it just says, this my redress to my excellency to acquaint you, sir, that Casper Tubbs received a grant from Colonel Bouquet in the year 1762 of a tract of land lying on the 4 Mile Spring on the old road going to Ligonier. Uh, he went to have somebody survey it. The surveyor said he wouldn't because it was the property of Colonel Croghan. Um, and said Tubbs having better than 30 acres of land cleared. So if he started in November of 1762 and we're at June of 1769, he's cleared quite a bit of land already. Um, Wonder how many acres he did a year. Or did he do a bunch right off the bat? And then, I'm sure the Pontiac's uprising drove him into the fort for a while. Anyway, he asks that the governor um, consider his request, and that he says, I, said Casper Tubbs, having served as a soldier for the space of the war, um, I, said Tubbs, to give for the war use of the garrison 1/3 of said plantation, horses and cattle accepted, and this is the first good crop, I hope, with the assistance of God, to make good my grant, the last year's crop being all spoiled by the floods. And I had a hard time figuring out what that word was. But then I did a bit of research and I found out that Fort Pitt has a tendency to flood. And by flood, I mean flood bad. George Washington said, hey, great place to build a fort. Yeah, he wouldn't have said that if he'd seen how high those rivers get when they flood. 40 feet above their their beds is what they flood to. Um, Fort Pitt, Colonel Bouquet actually wrote that almost a year and a half's worth of earthwork that they had made, dug, built up was lost because of a flood. It just got carried away. Um, and so things were not easy for poor Casper or his family. They had to deal with the war, and then they had to deal with all the floods, and I'm sure the Indian problem was constant, even after um, Pontiac's uprising was over. This is Bouquet's readout. The plaque above the door dates it to 1764, making it, I believe, the oldest standing building in Pittsburgh to this day. Um, like I said, it was a two flat for a while, which is why it still exists. The other ones were torn down and people reused the building materials, but somebody actually lived in this one, so they didn't tear it down. And the Daughters of the American Revolution did a ton of work to bring it back to what it would have looked like originally. And they maintain it to this day, and they do a fantastic job. And I think it's cool that, chances are very high that Casper Taub, if he didn't actually step foot in this building, I guarantee you he saw it. Especially considering he was supposedly the caretaker, according to this article, mentioning his, I believe, great 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 grandson Richard Mellon, not great great, but most every mention of Casper Taub and his relationship to the wine biddles is actually off by a generation. So most of the trees don't show They show his daughter marrying a wine biddle, but it was actually his granddaughter who did. So this has a bunch of different documents, and there's even a little bit of a family tree on here, some pictures showing the different documents related to the original Casper Taub grant. The top one is a fascinating document. It's from 1817, and like I said, Casper died in, we believe, early 1771. Um, his will was dated in February of 1771. It does not survive, but it's mentioned in a couple documents, including this one from Rebecca and Jacob Conrad, uh, where she says she is the daughter of Casper Taub, deceased, that she lives in Hardy County, Virginia, and that her father left her and her at least one sister his land. She came back all these years later. Like I said, it's 1817 now, and she has her sister's grandchildren at this point buy her out of her share of the property for $3,000 in 1817. Huge, huge sum of money. And they paid it, and they owned all of Casper and his son Jacob's land, which amounted to 562 acres by the time it was all said and done. Now, Casper's grandchildren also did very, very good marriages, and the Negley family would end up with a huge chunk of it. And eventually, the Mellon family would marry in. And I don't want to say the Mellon fortune came from Casper Taub, because it didn't. But marrying into that family enabled them to enabled Thomas Mellon to increase his land holding by adding what he had purchased from his own legal practice. He poured all of his money into buying land. Well, then he married into a landed family, and they started selling off pieces of it. So, yes, you could argue in a way part of the Mellon fortune was based on the fact that they had all this land in a rapidly expanding city that they could sell off piecemeal, and they did. And his descendants were selling, Casper's descendants were selling land in Pittsburgh up until like the Civil War. And to this day, the Mellon family is worth over $14 billion. And they are probably the most well-known family in Pittsburgh. Um, they've done so much for the city. In 1819, Casper's granddaughter, Barbara Negley, and her husband donated an acre and a half of land to build a church and a school. And through various incarnations, this is now the fifth building to occupy the site. And this one was donated by Richard Mellon and his wife in honor of their mothers. And it is just stunningly beautiful, and I'm in awe of the fact that this guy could just build such a beautiful church and donate it to the city. on land that his own ancestors had already donated. It's just fantastic. I love it. And I think it just goes to show this is the American dream. Casper Taub's family, my family, lived the American dream to the fullest extent possible. Like some of the Mellon mansions that used to be around Pittsburgh were just ridiculous. But it wasn't all bad because look at what they donated. I think it's just absolutely phenomenal.